Supply chain transformations in the 2020s are fraught with risk. There's a number of pitfalls to be aware of. But what exactly are those risks that we need to be aware of as we embark on a supply chain transformation? That's exactly what I want to talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And much of the work we do in the digital transformation space is focused on helping organizations through their supply chain transformations, either as part of a standalone supply chain transformation or as part of a broader enterprise-wide digital transformation. But supply chain transformations today look a lot different than they did prior to 2020. There's a lot of new risks, a lot of new considerations and pitfalls that we need to be aware of. So what I want to do today is talk about the top 5 risks you should be aware of as you embark on your supply chain transformation. One of the biggest challenges with supply chain transformations today is that employees and organizations in general are oftentimes set in their ways. They're stuck in the status quo of how things used to work within supply chain management. And if you think about supply chain management as a function, going back to the 80s and 90s, they've been pretty predictable. It's been pretty stable in terms of building out these global supply chains that organizations have spent decades building. But then all of a sudden, in the 2020s, we've been asked to change the way we think about our supply chains. Supply chain management as a discipline has completely been disrupted. And so now we need to think about how can we change our way of doing business? How can we change our operational model? How do we change our culture? How do we change our focus and priorities as supply chain managers? And that's hard for people. Change management is critical for any sort of transformation, but especially in supply chain management where people have been pretty comfortable with the way the world has worked for decades now, and now they're suddenly being asked to change pretty quickly. So as we embark on a supply chain transformation, we just need to be aware of this human dynamic. We need to be aware of the human risks and the organizational change risks that go along with the status quo. Another challenge with supply chain transformations today is that a lot of supply chains need immediate relief. We need to get an ROI and we need to get improvements in our supply chain now. We don't necessarily have time to wait 3 or 4 or 5 years to deploy a massive global enterprise-wide ERP system. So a lot of organizations now are stuck with a dilemma. Do we just go deploy a point solution to help fix some of our supply chain issues, knowing that we might create other integration issues or neglect other organizational needs outside the supply chain? Or do we just go ahead with that best-of-breed focused approach, knowing that we can fix and get immediate results from the supply chain right away? Another challenge with supply chain transformations today, which actually ties back to the first one I mentioned with the status quo, is that the concentrated risk with vendors is a real problem with supply chains. So in other words, we can't just deploy new technologies or even new processes and expect that that's alone is going to fix our supply chain. We also need to fundamentally rethink how our supply chain is organized, and more specifically, what types of vendors we rely on and how diversified or concentrated our risk is for certain vendors. So for example, during the pandemic, a lot of organizations found that they were overly dependent on 1 or 2 or a small handful of vendors, and when they couldn't deliver a raw material or a component, it completely brought the entire supply chain for that organization to its knees. So that's really opened up the eyes for a lot of organizations and a lot of supply chain managers to realize that they need to diversify risk, they need to decentralize vendor risk, and they need to find new ways of operating, or at the very least have contingency plans for alternate vendors that can help support their supply chain. So that concentration of vendor risk that we've become so accustomed to, or in some cases we just didn't realize existed, is something that's a risk and a pitfall that we need to navigate and mitigate as part of our supply chain transformation. Labor shortages are a challenge for a lot of different industries, and supply chain management is a similar industry that's struggling with a similar problem. And the reasons for labor shortages are multifaceted. There's economic turmoil. A lot of the world is either in or entering an economic recession, which is causing them to tighten their belts and to watch how they spend money. And in some cases, they're understaffing critical functions like supply chain management. So that's certainly not helping the world today in terms of supply chain disruptions, knowing that it's harder than ever to get labor to support those supply chains. You also have inflation and rising wages, which is creating a lot of cost pressure for organizations, which again is causing many organizations to underinvest or to cut back on their investments in supply chain labor. So the fact that supply chains are likely to have labor shortages now and in the future, or at least the foreseeable future, means that going through a transformation is going to be that much more difficult because we're already constrained with our resources, and now we're going to throw a transformation on top of them. So we just need to be aware of this risk, and we need to plan accordingly. We may not be able to change that reality overnight, the fact that there are going to be labor shortages, but we can be more realistic about defining a digital strategy and a transformation plan that takes that limitation into consideration. So I mentioned before how supply chains are struggling with the status quo. The fact that organizations are used to the way things have always worked with global supply chains the way they were prior to the 2020s. And all of the changes that we're seeing in supply chain management are leading toward cultural change for a lot of supply chain managers and their supply chain teams. What I mean by that is they're having to rethink how they do business. They're having to rethink the status quo. They're having to change their culture and their focus and their priorities. For example, organizations now are not only focused on cost efficiency, reducing costs, reducing inventory, but now they're having to shift their thinking and think that in some cases, lower cost isn't necessarily better if it comes at the expense of not being able to ship product on time or to meet customer demand. So now we're seeing that organizations are tilting the scale from cost efficiency to customer service and fulfillment. So ensuring that we have the right product in the right place at the right time for our customers when they need them is becoming more important than doing it at the lowest cost possible. Prior to the 2020s, cost was one of the biggest, if not the biggest driver for supply chain managers. And now that priority has been shifted quite a bit in today's day and age. So all of these changes require cultural change. It certainly requires new technologies, new business processes, but it also requires new ways of thinking and new ways of managing the human dynamic of supply chain management. Now, for more information about change management, if that's a topic you're interested in, I encourage you to download our Guide to Organizational Change Management, which I've included a link to below. That provides a plethora of recommendations and best practices for how to manage the human side of change for supply chain transformations and digital transformations in general. I've also included a number of other resources that are meant to help you through your supply chain transformation, so I encourage you to check out some of the links that I've included in the description field below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day. Reached the third stage of their digital transformation. Oh gosh, I was gonna say risks. The first risk to be aware of is a, what's that word? My kids always say, "Are you serious right now?" Like from TikTok. There's a word for it, it's a verb. Can you help me? It's a verb.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding.